everything boils down to, from a risk perspective, of what is a safe device. And safety is very well defined by the ISO 14971 regulation as freedom from unacceptable risk. And that's kind of a loaded thing. What does that really mean? But I think there's a lot of factors that go into designing and developing a device, especially at the beginning, that can kind of guide designers, developers into creating a device that is free from unacceptable risk. So this slide is just intended to give a very high level of the various types of risks, especially from a medical device perspective. I think a lot of people, when we're looking at risk, really look at the risk of harm to the patient. And that's key. I think that's huge. But there's also a number of other risks that go into this. So there's usability, human factors. If you have a device that collects, projects data, personal health information, so there's privacy risk, there's cyber risk. So if you have a wireless device that can connect to your device or connect your device to a system, is there a threat of some type of bad actor accessing your system? There's also technical risks, business risks, and supply chain risks. I kind of wanted to pause there, Joe. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I was going to jump into, because those top ones are very much FDA will care about those, right? FDA doesn't care very much about your business risks or your supply chain risks. They care about your whether you're going to harm a patient or a clinician or even the environment. But you as a company do care about business risks and supply chain risks, right? So even though from a regulatory point of view, the things that you're primarily focused on is making sure you don't hurt anybody. From a business point of view, you're looking at things like, if we develop this product, are people actually going to use it? If we develop this product, can we actually build it once the design is ready? And that last one, the supply chain risks. Anybody on this call who's involved in developing or manufacturing medical devices, they're shaking their heads, because supply chain issues have become really challenging right now. And so from a product development point of view, of course, you're focused on kind of the regulatory pieces of this, from a making sure you don't hurt anybody. But from a business point of view, those are other things, and you can use a very similar mentality of trying to really identify those potential risks early and figure out ways to de-risk them as early as possible in the process.
I brought my supply chain expert on the call. Paul, I thought we agreed that you would wear a hat, your cowboy hat.
Yeah, actually we did. I'm sorry, I'm out of compliance.
That's a risk that I took. But I think that was an acceptable risk. What do you have to say about supply chain risks before you even get started on?
I know, right? I mean, I was like trying not to nod my head and get excited when I saw, I saw that the last, and ironically the last piece, which is most often why people think of it too late. So yes, obviously I'm in the supply chain business. We're an FDA certified contract manufacturer. But I'm on a mission. I started this new tagline, hashtag supply chain 101. Man, I'm educating people to come and rethink supply chain solutions.
I like that. Right? As a marketer, I like that.
I will put one video out there. It's on LinkedIn. I just did it yesterday, the day before. I woke up thinking of that, and I put it out. But I think education
people
is really,
make little videos.
Yeah, education is really key, right?
That's all that's left.
Yeah, when thinking about medical devices, because there are solutions. I see the challenges. People come. I had a client come to me just the other day, and they said, we have 1,000 pallet locations. We need to move from one warehouse to the other. And I said, why do you have so much product when you're only moving, they're only a month? And they're like, well, because the supply chain problem. So it's really impacting, first access to product. It's impacting cash flow, which then impacts profit, limited resources. They're leaving a facility because that facility, a cog in their supply chain, because of COVID, can't fulfill on the SLAs because of human resources. The impact is low. So the entire supply chain, they had not built redundancy, resilience, things like that. And that's sort of my new mission is like supply chain.
You mean to convey that they have inventory in 1,000 different places?
No, we call it a pallet location is one pallet. So that is 48 by 40 by 48.
Okay, so he has 1,000 pallets.
1,000 pallets, and he doesn't need 1,000 pallets. He only needs, 50 pallets a month. But what they did is they went ahead and hoarded.
Yeah.
when they found supplies, because there were so many variables in 2021,
Mhm.
right? And if when I asked for his sales forecast, they've got enough product for about a year, and they don't cash out that much. So now we're redesigning the entire strategy, manufacturing in the US, bringing in components. It's much easier. Bring products in trays, not big boxes. You can put much more in a container. And so it's a lot of creativity.
Let me plug your workshop. Paul and the founder of Extron, Sandeep Dugal, are going to give a 3-hour workshop at 10X on vital supply chain strategies. Thank you, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Okay, Jack.
All right, cool. So let's go on.
Right. So backing up a little bit to the design controls. In the United States, the design controls is a process that's defined by the quality system regulation. It's very analogous to ISO 1345, which is also a quality management system standard. The key here is that these two regulations are harmonized. In other words, they don't contradict each other. So if you're following ISO 1345 or 21 CFR 820, you're hitting both. So that's really good news. But here, I think everybody's kind of seen this waterfall. And what it really is that it's the process, the design control process. So from a design control process, everything starts with at the very beginning. What is the basic user needs of the product? It flows through inputs, design outputs, design verification, validation, and all of those are key critical steps. The part here that's important in terms of risk is that by definition of having a controlled process, like the design control process, you're actually incorporating risk into the design process. The process itself is inherently a risk-based process. So at the end of the process, when you have a product that you can market, that you verified and validated, because you follow the design control process, you're basically demonstrating that your risk is safe for use. In terms of risk, I love this. I actually did this exercise in preparation for this call. But I looked at the term risk in the CFR as well as the ISO 1345 regulation. And it's interesting that in the entire quality system regulation, the term risk is literally only mentioned once. But it's mentioned in one big area, and that's the design validation area. That's where the rubber meets the road in terms of proving that your device meets the intended use and the needs of the user. So it's big, right? It's also in the FDA cybersecurity guidance. So when you talk about cybersecurity and the risks related to wireless technology in terms of threats and vulnerabilities, the guidance itself actually references the design validation process. So there's a link there in terms of making sure that you have appropriate risks in the design control process. There are also design reviews at critical stages. All of this leads to making sure that you have a design process that yields a safe device. So again, the key here is the design control process is intended to yield a very safe device. Of course, presuming that you've followed it and you've incorporated reasonable design controls along the way to mitigate significant risks that are unacceptable to users or for the safe use of the device.
If you've noticed me typing, it's me, hearing all of these keywords and writing people on Premium saying, you should be on this call, you need to get on, where are you, kind of stuff. There's a lot of folks in the community right now that need to understand what you're sharing. Please continue.
So going into unacceptable risks, this is a little tricky because this is where we kind of dive into how do you actually do a risk analysis for a medical device. It's a very defined process. It's defined by ISO 14971, which is the standard for risk management, but it goes through a few stages that are pretty critical. First and foremost, there's a risk analysis. This is where you're looking at the intended use, you're staying within that framework, and you're looking at the potential risks of the device based on what it's intended to do. And then you're also looking at potential foreseeable misuse of the device. How can someone take it and use it in a very inappropriate way and cause harm to somebody? You're looking at characteristics that are related to safety, some hazardous situations, and then you're doing a risk estimation. You're really looking at what are the probabilities that harm can occur from a hazard or a hazardous situation. And then you go through a number of activities, apply some risk controls, and then repeat the whole cycle all over again to see if your risk control has yielded a lesser risky device. And once that's all complete, You look at your risk controls again, and you see if there's any risks that have arisen from the application of risk controls. It's a very iterative process, and it starts very early in the design and development process.
Yeah, so maybe we can spend a minute kind of thinking through what that might look like in terms of a product, right? If you're developing a product, I'll give an example of a product that we've developed in the past in a company that we work with. So it's a device for female urinary incontinence. And so it's a device that's inserted into the vagina, communicates with a phone wirelessly, and provides real-time visualization of the shape and motion of the device. And so by doing that, it can train a woman to perform pelvic floor exercises and strengthen her pelvic floor muscles to reduce urinary incontinence. And so if you think about that, as you're doing a risk analysis, you start thinking about like, what are the things that could go wrong? There might be some risks around, even if it's being properly used, right? So proper use would be for the patient to insert the device into the vagina. So that's that's one of the elements of the intended use. Well, what could go wrong there, right? Well, if you don't choose material that's biocompatible, for example, the patient might, get some sort of, rash or something like that, right? It can be detrimental to their health. Or if the size of it is not correct, it might be painful, or it might not be effective, right? Or, if for some reason there's a risk that you end up with a sharp edge somewhere, it can cut the patient, right? So those are all different types of things that could happen with the intended use. So you're trying to think about, what are the things that could go wrong if this is designed improperly, and how do we mitigate those? And even before you start thinking about mitigating those, you're asking yourself, okay, what's the probability that this could happen? And then, what's the potential harm that this is going to happen? And as you implement risk controls to reduce that, so you might say, okay, the material must be biocompatible and meet, ISO 10993 types of requirements, that sort of thing. Or, the shape needs to be a particular size. So during that process, you might be, for example, consulting with urogynecologists who are experts in the field that can tell you, what shape and what size is appropriate. So you're getting input from other people to understand how do you control for those types of risks. So those are all parts of that process. And then as you introduce some sort of control to reduce that risk, that will usually drive new requirements for the product. And what you have to make sure is that then you consider, well, if we make this change, does that introduce new risks that we haven't considered in the past? You kind of go back to the drawing board and check that. And if it does, then again, you go through the process of evaluating if it's acceptable or unacceptable and putting in additional controls. So, just to give people a more concrete example of how this process goes.
I brought a few folks on. I brought Luke on because he raised his hand. I brought Eddie on because he works on urinary incontinence. And I'm inviting my friend Alan to join us as a panelist too. He just assumed a role as CEO of from what I can tell, mobile wireless medical device company who probably has a question or two. So Alan, please accept my invitation to be a panelist. And Luke, what did you have to contribute?
I've seen a lot of meetings going on the reasonably foreseeable misuse. And if you have a lot of fantasy, then you can invent a lot of reasonably foreseeable misuse. But your keynote speaker at 10X London was BNLI. He wrote a good book, and you can use it I can quote, that the misuse must be deliberate and well-intentioned. So not, if I want to harm you, I throw something at your head. That's not foreseeable misuse. It must be beneficial to the user or to the patient. It must be feasible, so you can do it with the device, but it's not intended use. It must be safe, and it must be ethical. And if it doesn't comply to those 6 requirements, it's not reasonably foreseeable misuse. And that's nice to know, because a lot of meetings go about reasonable foreseeable misuse. And also, sometimes if you do a risk analysis, you come up with really remote risks, and you have to try to mitigate them. And it's we always say, are you willing to use the device on your mother or not? And if you're willing to use it on your mother, it should be safe. And if it's not, then if it's there and it's really remote, you can always ask yourself, is the risk for my apropos? Or you can always say, if you identify a risk and don't mitigate it well enough, you get complaints. If you don't say it's a risk, then people get after you. But you can always say, we did not identify any risk in this. So you have shown you have thought about it, but you didn't identify any risk. And that's for remote risks. And that's really good to get the notified bodies off your back.
I just,
and just to maybe add to that, so that's great, Luke, I appreciate that. You know, you also have to recognize that there are times where there is a risk and there's really no means of mitigating it to below a certain level, but the benefit that the product provides exceeds the downside of the risks. And so that's where there's opportunities to do risk benefit analyses on certain areas. So, you know, sometimes, you know, it's just, you know, there's no way to get around certain risks. You know, so you do everything you can. And then at the end, if it's still higher than some threshold that you've established, you perform a risk benefit analysis around that and come to a conclusion and document that. And that's part of what you're doing in this process as well. So, I mean, I think the primary focus really is to help you drive risk down, right? So you really should be, you know, as Luke said, you kind of have to think about this, and it's very subjective in many respects, right? You have to be thinking about this, like, would I want to use it on a family member? Would I want this device used on me, or would I want to use it myself? That's great, right? And then beyond that, so that's kind of the piece of like, you should be doing this no matter what, because it's the right thing to do. The other piece of this is you need to do this in a documented, systematic way, because this is a regulated space. And so if the FDA comes in or another, you know, in Europe, they come in and perform an audit of your systems, and they say, well, you didn't even, you know, evaluate this very obvious risk. And you say, well, no, we did. I remember we talked about it in a meeting, and we all said that it wasn't a big deal because we did this other thing. We're like, you know, like, that's not a formal documented means of performing risk analysis. So you might have met the needs of the first, you know, type of reason why you do this, right? Maybe you did perform that analysis and came to a conclusion it wasn't a risk, but you didn't meet the needs of the second one, which is to protect your company by ensuring that you've documented that you're keeping, that you're going through this process.
That's why your intended use is so important, because then you can identify your benefits and not later on. You have to do it with intended use.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Luke. Alan, please reintroduce yourself to the group with your new title and new company.
Okay, sorry, I put you on mute. My wife is leaving for heading out to LA for a sales call. So yeah, so my name's Alan Ehrlich. I was consulting for the last 3, 4, 5 years in medical device, commercial marketing, sales. And then I was introduced to a gentleman on the board of a company. It's called Aries Medical. So I'm now
spelled AIRES.
Yeah, medical. Yeah. Which may not be the name going forward for long, but that's a whole nother issue we can talk about. Joe possibly we may have to rebrand it. But so I was talking to them more about consulting, and they needed somebody the conversation turned to becoming CEO of the company. So I've joined the company February 1st. So they're developing a unique, it's a non-invasive ventilator product with some new technology, small form factor that could be portable, transportable, could be carried by for COPD patients for home care use. And so I'm now trying to uncover what's going on here. And one of the things obviously is making sure we have design controls in place, QMS. So
I've commandeered the camera here momentarily, Jackie. Do you have this is the part where I'm like, oh, Jose has to see this. What do you have a video on here about how this works or what it's doing?
I don't think so. I mean, to be honest, Joe, I haven't really gotten much into that part yet.
I just wanted to see if there was some way we could, oh, this is a one-page site. Okay, well, this is as close as we're going to get. Designed with the patient in mind to promote adherence. NIV, I don't know what that means.
Non-invasive ventilation.
Thank you.
Typically, they'll have possibly portable oxygen. I mean, so if you think of the companies in the market today, Philips, Respironics is the leader with the Trilogy. There's ResMed, there's Breas, there's a lot of home hospital ventilators. This is more home. It could be used in hospital, but the focus is for home use. There's one called Voxen, if you recall, they partnered with General Motors during the pandemic. They have a 5-mode non-invasive ventilator, 5 unique codes, 5 unique modalities, which then has a code. So this has a code. The one we're working on, our first product, would have a code EO466.
Would, as in you're not yet commercialized?
No, but we're still in development. Yep, we're still in development. Yep.
Probably need to have that cited somewhere on the site if it's not already.
Yeah. Thanks for letting me know. To be honest, I haven't really even.
Yeah, CEO's a big job, man.
Just got there, man. Give him a minute.
I know. We just got there.
Yep. So
anyhow, I just wanted to make that introduction. And anything leap to your mind, Jose and Jackie, when you just say, hey, I know you got a lot going on, Mr. CEO, but among the first three things I'd have you do, make sure you ask someone blank, blank, blank. What's that?
A lot of things, right? I mean, so yeah, like going back to the list that we talked about earlier, there's a lot of things that you look at early in a program, and it's everything from kind of technical feasibility, which again, that's not a thing FDA is particularly concerned about. That's kind of a business concern. To then the more regulatory things are, okay, how can this harm a patient, right? And things, that maybe aren't blatantly obvious, but that does look like it's cloud connected, right? Like there's wireless connectivity. And so you're looking at things like, can this interfere with another device?
Yeah.
Can some other device interfere with this, right? So you're gonna have to do testing for FCC. You're gonna have to do testing for 601 -1-2, right? Electromagnetic compatibility. And so it's thinking about those things early. And maybe there's things you can do early to mitigate that, right? Maybe you end up going with a wireless module that's pre-certified or, things like that. So yeah, it's really kind of thinking about like, what are all the things that could go wrong in every category? And it's helpful oftentimes in that process to kind of have pre-established categories. So it forces you to think about, okay, let me think about biocompatibility. Let me think about usability. Let me think about cybersecurity. Let me think about, all the things that FDA cares about. And then let me think about the things that FDA won't care about, but I care about: supply chain issues, second sourcing parts, those sorts of things.
what company are you guys with? Bold?
Yeah, it's called Bold Type. Yeah,
BOLDTYPE.com. You know a guy who knows a guy, so we'll talk afterward.
Okay.
Yeah.
Eddie?
Yeah, no, I don't want to commandeer the whole thing because what you're talking about is great. In fact, Joe, when you were saying you were sending people, I literally was sending it to our design partners saying, this is really interesting. You should get on here right now. But hopefully, if they can't, they might be able to access the recording. Yeah. So we've got one device already in male urinary retention. We've actually got not one, but two grant-funded projects that we've just started at the beginning of this year. One for female incontinence, a new device, and a modifying device for male incontinence. So, and we're in that early stage of design criteria gathering that you were just describing. And one of the acronyms, I'm based in the UK, and one of the acronyms that we've got over here is PPI. I don't know if that's which stands for public-patient interaction. So gaining not just the clinicians, but also the users' input onto what the device, and also gathering that whole thing of what's all out there, what's wrong with what's out there, so that what we're doing is actually going to solve the inefficiencies of the current devices.
Yeah.
I'd love to catch up with
exactly.
you offline about your experience with, because again, what we're doing is slightly different, obviously, from what you've been developing for that client of yours. But sure. I think there's an awful lot of what you've done might be helpful for us if you could share that information without breaching any confidentialities.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, a lot of this stuff is public knowledge. Obviously, we'd never share anything that's confidential, but I'm happy to have a conversation around that. And one of the things, as you're going through that risk analysis, maybe Jackie, you can speak to this because I know this is something that I've seen you do. I don't directly do this, but is looking at other devices, maybe a device that you're looking to use as a predicate device is like, have they had any kind of reported issues? You should be looking at that yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So Jackie, I don't know if you want to speak to that directly.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I do that a lot. So when I go through a regulatory assessment to identify the classification of the device, a potential predicate device, I immediately go to FDA's website and I look at the product code. And in there's a little link to a TPLC, which is the total product life cycle. And in there, you can find a ton of information on potential predicate devices, links to the MOD database, which contains adverse event reports. And we look at the risk from that perspective, and that can formulate a hazard analysis for your device, which can feed into your risk management process.
Fantastic.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
we'll talk kind of the next section of this is getting into the nuts and bolts of how you go about doing this. And again, if folks have other, so this particular next section, I'm really curious to hear people's thoughts on this, especially who've done product development, because it can be done in various different ways. And, we'll show you how we've done it in the past and love to get people's input on it.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. All right, please continue, Jackie.
This slide was just kind of related to the last slide. It's literally out of FDA's guidance on cyber. The only thing I'm presenting here is that it's the process, while it's related to threats and vulnerabilities instead of probabilities and harms, the process for assessing cyber risk and product risk is pretty much largely the same. So in terms of using a risk management tool, commonly, I think across industry, the design failure modes and effects analysis is the most common. And that starts with early identifying all the risks and then looking at the probability of harm of those risks and the severity. So if a risk act or a hazard actually happened, what's the severity or harm of that severity to the patient? So you come up with this criteria in advance and you kind of make some assumptions on probabilities, on your scoring. You can do this in a 5x5 like we have here. You can do it in a 3x5, you can do by 3x3, you can do it in any way you really want to, whatever really makes sense for your device.
This is something that you put together. This is not standard pulled off.
No, this is one that we put together for one of the products that we developed. It's very similar to it. We commonly use a 5x5. It allows a little bit of flexibility, but for maybe a low risk device, you could modify it. What really ever makes sense for your device.
Yeah, and the concept is not unique to us, right? This is sort of par for the course for risk analysis, and I think something very similar to this is shown in 14971. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jackie. But you have to, for a particular product, like we have this in our SOP, but when we do the risk management plan for a specific product, we have to think about this and say, okay, depending on the volume, depending on the risk level, the probabilities might be different, right? You might be looking at a different categories as what you call frequent, might be different in one product type than another. There's a lot of subjectivity to this. It's probably one of the most challenging pieces of this, particularly for engineers, where for an engineer, you're trying to go like, especially if you don't have data, right? If this is a brand new device that's never been out on the market, how do you know how probable this is? And you really just have to use your best judgment. And then post-launch, this is an important point, risk management doesn't end after you've launched the product. You've got a certain responsibility as you learn new things from the field to come back and reassess things, because there may be a failure mode that you expect to be low probability, and so it's an acceptable risk. And then you start getting field data telling you that, hey, this happens more than you were expecting. You have a responsibility to go back, evaluate, what that does to your risk analysis, and then, implement risk controls, and even, in the extreme case, potentially this could drive a recall. If this is something that's really putting patients at risk, most of the time, it's not quite that severe, but, it is an ongoing process that continues. But the gist of this, for those who maybe aren't familiar, is obviously the more probable and the more severe something is, the less acceptable it's going to be. So if something happens very, very rarely, so it's got a probability of harm of a 1, it's very improbable, and it's very low severity, like it's just a little nuisance to the user or something, that's going to be all the way on the bottom right, and that's going to be acceptable. On the other hand, if it's the other extreme, if it's something that's going to happen every time the patient uses it or very often, and it could be catastrophic, obviously that's unacceptable. The challenging part gets more in the middle, where it's like, well, this is improbable, but it could be moderately severe. What does that mean in terms of acceptability? And that's in those middle areas where it can be more of a challenge to make sure that you use good judgment there, maybe document some rationale there.
Thank you. Please continue.
Next slide.
So if we kind of put this into action, there's really two primary phases of the risk management process. And that's an initial assessment, and then there's a post-assessment. So what's displayed here is really the initial risk evaluation. So what we're looking at is hazardous situations and harms. Then we're reviewing and assessing the probability of that harm. we're assigning a severity score. So if there is a harm, how severe is it? And then we're doing an initial risk acceptance review. And that's based on the table in the bottom. So if you look at, for example, a biological risk or biological hazard, then you're looking at the hazardous situation, which is basically the sequence of events that may cause or contribute to a hazardous situation occurring. So in the terms of biocompatibility, if you do not select a biocompatible material, there is a potential that a user is exposed to a skin sensitive or irritating material. And that could lead to a rash or some other undesirable effect to the user. So you've identified that as a hazard or risk of the device. So now you want to kind of transition into what's the probability of this occurring prior to application of a risk control. So before you do anything, what's the probability of harm? You kind of want to rate this a little bit high because you're not applying any risk control. So in our example here, we've assigned a probability of harm of 3. And we've also assigned a severity of 3. And that's basically because this is a minor, moderate kind of effect to the user. And that gives us an acceptable risk. And it depends on how you define acceptable risk in terms of risk mitigation in your risk management plan. You may have signed acceptable risk as not requiring further mitigation. That's acceptable to do. But in this example below it, where we have an energy risk, where a possible overheating of the battery may contribute to a burn to a patient, where the probability might be a 3 prior to risk control, and the severity is a little higher, that leads to an unacceptable risk for our risk acceptance criteria. And an unacceptable risk, as we know from the earlier slides, safety is freedom from unacceptable risk. This would require us to do, for sure, some type of mitigation to mitigate that potential risk to the patient or user.
And just to jump in for a little bit here, I mean, a couple of things. So the first one is that even things that are acceptable, usually you still try to mitigate them because, again, even beyond the regulatory requirements around this, you're ultimately launching a product that you want to be successful. So if you think there's a straightforward way to mitigate a risk that's, even though it's acceptable, it's just wise to do that, right? Like even if the risk of a patient, even if a patient getting a rash, if you look at that and you go, well, look, the severity of that is only minor or moderate, you still don't want 20% of your patients getting a rash because that's not going to do a lot of good for your company's reputation, and certainly it'll do a lot more harm to patients than is necessary. So even when a risk is acceptable, most of the time you still try to mitigate it. But sometimes there's like like the extent of effort that would be required is substantial, or maybe it causes the product to be harder to use for the patient. So there's trade-offs there. Then you might have to compromise and settle on something that's maybe not as low as you would like, but is acceptable. So that's kind of the first point, is that it's not just, oh, that one's acceptable, don't need to worry about it. The second point I would make is that, here we're showing a single probability and a single severity. Another variant of this that we actually employ is to have 2 probabilities and a severity. So you have a probability that the event occurs, and then you have a probability that if the event occurs, it causes harm. And sometimes that just makes the process a little bit simpler because maybe it's a complex sequence of events that has to happen. And the first thing you're trying to determine is, how likely is it that this thing will even happen? So like, for example, in the second one, the battery overheats or catches fire during failure. You might first consider, okay, what's the probability that would even happen? And then you might say, okay, if that does happen, what's the probability that the patient gets hurt? And the combination of those two then goes into your probability of harm. So those 2 things. So it's just another approach to doing this that sometimes is helpful. We're now going to the next slide that shows us, okay, we implement a control, and Jackie, feel free to continue.
Yeah, so after you've applied a risk control, you want to identify what you did to mitigate the risk. So in the case of biocompatibility or biological risk, you're probably going to do some type of biocompatibility testing, or you're going to have a specification that ensures that you do biocompatibility testing for at least a patient contacting component. In the case of energy, maybe you have a design feature. You're using a very specific type of battery, a non-rechargeable coin cell, or something that doesn't necessarily contribute to potential for overheating or a fire. And then once you do that, once you've applied your risk control, you go back through the process again and you reevaluate what's the probability of harm, what's the severity. I will say this, I looked at a number of warning letters related to risks, and I talked to a number of people in the industry. And one of the common things that people are getting hit on is that severity is changed pre and post risk evaluation. That's not really the case. If a harm is going to happen and you've assigned a severity to it, that severity doesn't change based on your reduction in probability. So the only number that really changes in your risk evaluation is the probability scores. Severity should stay the same regardless of whether it's an initial evaluation or a revised risk evaluation. And once you do that,
Yeah, and that's just jumping again. That can be a little bit tricky too. I know, way back when I was first doing this sort of thing, sometimes you think of risk controls that sort of logically seem to reduce the severity. So, okay, maybe it can still happen, but it's going to be less severe for the patient if it happens. And it's just one of those things where, do you really want to get into that kind of a fight with the regulatory bodies who are used to following this path? Sometimes what makes more sense is to have a different line item in this that has a different severity and a different probability, because it might be that it's low probability that something happens and it's a higher severity, and maybe it's a higher probability that it happens, in a slightly different way or under different constraints and has a lower severity. And so it's better to break it up than to try to argue that your risk control changes the severity. So this is kind of a very practical thing that I know surprised me when I was first doing this. The other piece I'll say to this is, if you remember back when we were looking at the design controls and we said this is an iterative process, failure mode and effects analysis is not something that happens once. You're really looking at it through each phase of development. Because, for example, like this, you oftentimes have requirements early in the process, even before you do risk control or risk analysis, because you need to know what you're building to really understand what the various failure modes are. But at the same time, if you look here, the risk control is driving new requirements, and that's common. So now, you had requirements, you maybe came up with an architecture, then you performed a risk analysis, and then those risk controls drove new requirements. Maybe that changes the architecture to the product. And so then again, that's where you kind of come back and look at this again a third time and say, okay, does that now introduce the new architecture, the new design, does that introduce new risks? So it's a continuous and iterative process. All right.
At the end, you want to maybe reference the risk verification activities, the items that really support that your risk has been controlled. And at the end of it, your risk acceptance ideally should lead to all acceptable risks. If it does not, I think Jose mentioned this earlier, you can do a risk benefit analysis where you weigh the benefits of use against the risks of use, and you come to some type of decision or documentation internally that allows you to accept that risk, even though your risk evaluation led to an unacceptable risk. Not very common, but it can happen, and it is allowed by the standard.
Jeff, if you're available, I invited you to become a panelist. I know you're working on your advanced scanner project, and I wondered if you had a direct question for these fine educated folks. Please continue.
Yeah. So yeah, and we'll certainly come back to this. The last slide is a kind of a, you might feel like it's very different, right? So what I did here was, I took a Gantt of a typical type of product that we might be developing, where over the course of the year, you're going through development and, prototyping and verification testing and transfer to manufacturing and all these different steps. I know this is kind of a busy slide, but I just want to point you to a couple of things. So one of them is, right up front here in the top left where it says PP, RP, RMP. So that's project plan, regulatory plan, and risk management plan. So very early in the process, you're even just planning on how are you going to mitigate risk for this project? How are you going to analyze it? What are the tools you're going to use? Who's going to be involved? You're doing some planning to prepare for doing your risk management. And then if you look down below where it says hardware, housing, software, so this might be a system that includes some electronics, it might include mechanical housing, it might include some embedded software, it might include some, mobile application or cloud application. And within those, you'll have a design failure modes and effects analysis. So you don't have to, you can do it just at the system level. We oftentimes break it down into the subsystems. It's just easier to manage that way for us. And so you might do one on just the electronics. What are all the things that could go wrong in the electronics? What are the things that could go wrong with software? What are the things that could go wrong with the mechanical system? So you're doing that failure modes and effects analysis. And that's really just your first pass at it. This is going to be a living document that you revisit. Another thing that I'm showing here that's related to risk, where you see on the top left where it says formative usability studies. So usability it's important, right? You want to make sure that what you develop is usable by the intended user. And there's two types of usability studies that you commonly do. One of them is formative, meaning like I think of it as like informative, right? So what feedback can we gain from potential users early that are going to drive design decisions that are hopefully going to make this a more usable product? So they're really at the front end to inform the development team and the design team as to how to design something that's really usable. And then later on, you'll do like a summative usability study. Oftentimes we help our clients put together the protocols for these, but they'll oftentimes run them because they've got direct connections with the users. Oftentimes they've got really great relationships with them, can easily recruit. This doesn't have to be a huge type of study. It could be 15 patients. I've seen this done over the course of 2 days with 15 patients. If that's, depending on the risk of the product, that might be perfectly acceptable. And so that comes later. So that's just a different type of risk. And that's one way that you might mitigate it is prototype early, things that are high risk. So that's one of our philosophies is, again, really thinking about what are the risk areas early so that you can come up with experiments early that then tell you what you need to know to de-risk them. So it's not just things like a battery is going to catch on fire. It's, maybe the patient's going to be confused by the user interface on this device. Or maybe, the patient's not going to know how to wash this device, and so it could grow bacteria. Well, what are the things we can do early to help reduce that probability? And then I show a couple of other things that commonly don't show up in risk analyses, but as a sign of the times, if you look down in the purple area where there's kind of like a white box that says order parts, right? So, under normal circumstances, you might not be ordering your electronic parts until later as you're getting ready to manufacture. Today, we tell our clients, once we have a preliminary schematic and we know what most of the electronic components are, you might choose to buy 6, so I'm sure we'll have thoughts on this, but from Paul. But today I tell people you might want to order those parts now because some things now have 52-week lead times. So, if you wait until the day that you're ordering boards from your manufacturer, you might not be launching till 6 or 8 months later than you were thinking. So we say, just if it makes financial sense for you, order the parts now. The risk that something's going to change is low. If it does, maybe in a bill of materials with 100 components, maybe there's like 3 or 4 that change. So it's a very small financial risk. Same thing with resins for some plastics, especially if you're looking at biocompatible materials, there might not be that many options. So you might want to order them early. So I wanted to put that there just as an example of something that's not necessarily safety related, but it's just the mentality that you have of evaluating things early. And the same thing on the technical front. So on the technical front, we try to look at a project and go, what about this is risky? Like what might not work the first time around and take 3 or 4 iterations? Is there a way for us to set up an experiment early with a breadboard, with a development kit, with a simple 3D prototyped model, a simple, software program early so that we prove out that we figure out how to do this and make sure that it's going to work before we implement it and go through all of the process and get to the end and then do, verification testing and something doesn't pass. If you're doing your first testing of a system, at the verification testing phase, that's a great example of, what's the title of this? Like doing it early so it doesn't come, before it's too late. Yeah, if you're waiting for verification testing phase of the project before you're testing out some of these things, it's too late. You've waited too long. So just wanted to give people other examples, and I'd love to hear questions or thoughts. Maybe people do things differently and they found different things that are smart to do.
We're at the top of the hour, so some people will be dropping off. This is being recorded. We can continue. As your marketer, may I heartily suggest you get this slide on your website, if not your homepage. Jeff, you're making things.
I am making
some risks.
I guess I got lucky and scheduled a meeting with Jose this morning before this.
Did you really?
Yeah, I'm sure he'll be very busy right after this. This is a great slide right here. And completely overwhelming and stuff. Me as a CEO does not want to get into, and glad there are people like you that can address these things for the team. I have all the things you talked about: the software, the mechanical housing, the electronic parts, and all of those things. So I worry about all these things, but honestly, I don't have the time to address them right now, or the bandwidth, or the clear direction on which way to go. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. We are looking to submit something by the end of the year. We've got a lot of other things that are going on that could distract us, other opportunities that may supersede bringing our own device to market. So I don't have any questions. I know I'm going to see you in a couple of weeks, but this whole presentation is just kind of overwhelming in the head.
You know, it makes my heart sing when team members work together, right?
Yeah.
Like this
I
little
saw
experiment
Jeff,
is actually working.
yeah. I saw mention that he's going to be at LSI in a couple of weeks, and I plan to be out there. So I said, hey man, like we should grab a cup of coffee or something. So I'm looking forward to that. And then at 10X, whoever's going, I know I've
Yeah,
met
be
a
there
lot
too.
of folks on this, and I'm looking forward to meeting people face to face. It's been a while since we meet people face to face. I'm excited to do
I'm
that.
so looking forward to that. I'm going
Yeah.
all out with the ice cream toppings this year. I mean, if anybody is, has a
That's
nut
what sounds
allergy or
good.
something, you've got to let me know ahead of time. Jackie, I don't know how many slides remain. Just to
That's it.
mention.
That's the last one. We're done.
Oh, look at that, number 14. That's
Yeah.
a good place to end.
That's it. So yeah, I mean, look, what I would say is, don't be overwhelmed by it. There's a reason, like the fact that you've got processes and you can be methodical about it, in fact, should lower the anxiety. I think if you don't have a good process in place, then it's like, oh crap, I know there's a lot of stuff to worry about and I just don't even know where to start. But once you've, whether you're doing this yourself or you're working with a partner who's done this several times, you realize that there's just a good process that you follow. You start early, really think about and write down what are all those things that could go wrong and figure out how to deal with them early. And then you don't have to stress about them. Then it's just, blocking and tackling once you've got that strategy in place.
Right on. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, well, maybe we're going to finish a little closer to regular time than expected. As Jeff suggested, there's probably a lot of questions that are going to come directly at you after this. So my work here is done.
Great. Yeah. You can always email me directly, Jose@boldtype.com. Jackie's is Jackie@boldtype.com. We keep it simple. Garish was on the call. He's Garish@boldtype.com. And then of course we're on the MDG Slack channel too. So feel free to reach out that way as well.
Okay. Next week, I don't know. I'm still looking for a speaker, but I'm filling in some gaps. So folks, if you have some suggestions or things that you're presently working on that you need free advice on, I'm your guy. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks. You guys.
Bye. Bye.